High in a Colorado valley no living soul had walked in a generation, walls of squared timber stood pale and silver against the dark timber, taller than any man. A young woman on a roan mare reined in at the foot of them, and the sight closed her throat, because every map she had ever trusted swore this place had never been built. She dismounted and stepped through the ruined gate, her boots stirring pine duff over stones that had once been a hearth. Kneeling, she worked her belt knife beneath a shifted stone and pried it up, and beneath it lay a canvas sack heavy with something that did not belong in an empty ruin. Her fingers found a folded letter beside it, brown along its creases, pressed hard in pencil by a hand long stilled. As she read the words of a woman dead more than 20 years, a scrap of red flannel slid loose, and inside it lay a brass compass that was the twin of the one already hanging against her heart. Far below, along the trail she had climbed, a cedar stake stood fresh in the ground, burned with a name that meant a powerful man wanted this valley too. She did not yet know that the letter in her hands and the money beneath the stone were about to set an 18-year-old girl against everything he owned. She was 18 years old, and the maps in her father's office had been lying to her for as long as she had known how to read them. Della Whitcomb rode out from the ranches along Cottonwood Fork to settle a mapmaker's argument that no one else in the valley cared to remember, to prove once and for all whether the fort marked on every old chart of Skyhold Park had ever been raised at all. She expected a bare meadow, perhaps a fallen chimney, perhaps nothing but grass and wind. What waited for her up that creek, weathered to the pale silver of bone and standing taller than any man on the place, was a thing no living soul in Colorado had ever claimed to see with their own eyes. The valley she came from ran narrow between two ridges of Ponderosa and Lodgepole, opening some 10 miles up into a wide grassy park that the ranchers spoke of the way people speak of a country they have never bothered to walk. Della had been born in a plank house half a mile above the second bend of the creek, in a spring that meant nothing to anyone but her mother, who had counted the months on her fingers through a hard winter. That mother was gone now. A fever had taken her when Della was 9, the same fever that carried off 2 other women in the settlement inside a single month, and after that, the house had gone quiet in a way that no amount of living ever managed to fill back up. Her father, Garrett Whitcomb, was 52 years old that spring and ran 300 head with a hard face and a habit of speaking each sentence as though it were the final word on its subject. He had remarried inside the year of his wife's death, a practical widow named Verna, who came up from the wagon road with 2 sons of her own, and a way of keeping a household that left no corner unaccounted for. Verna was neither cruel nor soft. She was exact. Her boys, Roy and Emmett Doyle, had grown into the ranch as though the ground had always been theirs, so that by the time Della was 17, Garrett spoke of them at the supper table as his heirs, and no voice in the room ever rose to correct him. Della learned to ride before she could properly read, and she read early. What she knew of the working world she had learned at the mouth of the creek, in the smithy of a man named Silas Renner, who had been 68. The first winter, he put a rasp in her hand and told her, the hoof, was a living thing that would tell you what it wanted if you were quiet enough to listen. Silas had been a soldier once in a life he did not describe, and after that, a surveyor's chainman who walked the high country with a compass and a length of chain, laying down the lines that other men would one day fence. He had lost a wife and a daughter to a sickness in a river town whose name he would never say aloud, and in Della, when she was 12 and still all elbows and stubbornness, he had recognized a stillness that most grown men never came to. He taught her to shoe, and then to set a wagon tire, and then to read a map, because Silas kept a leather-bound roll of frontier charts in a tin trunk beside his forge, and on the slow afternoons of winter, he unrolled them across his knees and showed her the pencil marks, the compass roses, the small square symbols with a flag drawn beside them that meant a fort had once been built and named. He showed her the one drawn into the upper reach of Skyhold Park, on the west side of the creek where the contour lines bent to make a low bench above the water. And he told her, in a voice as even as a level floor, that he had walked that country the better part of his life, and had never once met a person who had laid eyes on it. "A map is a promise," he told her the winter she was 14, tapping the little flag with a finger gone yellow at the nail. "And some promises get made by men who never rode out to keep them." That was the summer his cough took hold, a slow dragging thing that would not leave his chest. And one August afternoon, he called her into the smithy and pressed into her palm a brass pocket compass in a leather case, worn dark and soft with handling. The glass was scratched across its face, but the needle, when she held it flat, swung free and settled true to north. It had belonged to his daughter, he told her, who had been 10 years old when the sickness took her, and he had carried it every day of the long time since. He wanted Della to carry it now. He died in October, before the first snow closed the pass, and Della wore the compass on a lanyard beneath her shirt from that day forward and did not take it off, not to sleep and not to wash, until the leather grew as dark against her skin as it had been against his. By the spring she turned 18, the ranch had settled into a shape with no clear room in it for her. Roy Doyle was 25 now and married and running the north pasture. Emmett was 22 and ran the south with fewer words and harder hands. Garrett had begun to talk of the place as a thing to be halved cleanly between the two brothers. And Della had understood, without ever being told to her face, that she was expected to marry into one of the neighboring outfits and take her portion as a sum of money rather than a stretch of land. She did not argue the point. She had never argued with her father over anything, and she was not about to begin over a decision that, in his mind, had already closed like a gate behind her. She was not a plain girl, though she gave the fact little thought. She had her mother's coloring, a fall of dark honey hair she kept braided back off her face, and a scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose that the mountain sun deepened every summer. Her eyes were the gray of creek water under cloud, and there was in the way she carried herself a straightness that came from years of lifting and riding and setting her own shoulder to work no one had assigned her. People at the settlement noticed her, and then, meeting the level way she looked back, thought better of saying so. She moved through the world like someone who had learned early that she would have to carry her own weight, and had decided quietly that she did not much mind. What she asked her father for that April was the use of a horse and 3 days of provisions, and leave to ride up into Skyhold Park and settle the question of the fort for good. Silas's charts were hers now, along with the compass and the smithy and everything else the old man had owned, and she had come to feel that if she was to be handed off into a life she had not chosen, she would at least first ride out and answer the one question that had sat lodged in her chest since she was 12 years old. Garrett looked at her across the supper table a long moment and said only that she should take the roan mare and be back by Sunday. Verna passed her the bread without a word. The two brothers glanced at one another and held their peace. The night before she left, something happened at the ranch that Della had not expected and would carry with her a long while after. She came down into the dark kitchen before far first light to find a cloth bundle waiting on the table, tied with plain string, and beside it, a folded square of paper laid square to the edge of the wood. Inside the bundle were 4 biscuits, a piece of salt pork, wrapped in brown paper, a twist of coffee, and a tin of matches, the provisioning of a person going 3 days into the country, and no more. She had not asked for more, and none had been offered. But it was the paper that stopped her breath. She opened it in the yellow light of the single lamp and read it standing there in her coat. It was written in Verna's careful slanting hand, 6 lines and no more, and it told her plainly that Garrett and Roy and Emmett had spoken the night before about the dividing of the ranch, that a share had been set aside for Della in the form of $200 in coin and paper to be given at her marriage, that the house and the pastures would pass in equal halves to the 2 Doyle brothers, and that Garrett wished this understood clearly so there would be no confusion upon her return. It was signed simply Verna, with no word of feeling either way. Della read it twice through. She did not sit down. She did not go back up the stairs. She understood exactly what had been done to her, and she understood that it had not been done in cruelty but in something colder and more final than cruelty. A blow is honest. A blow admits it means you harm. This was the arithmetic of a ledger, the closing of a fence line, the shutting of a door in a distant room when you are the one who has been left standing on the wrong side of it. She had been named, and then she had been counted, and both the naming and the counting had been done in ink at a table where no chair had been set for her. "A man will measure his own daughter," she said to the empty kitchen, so quietly the words hardly stirred the air, "and never once feel the cold of the ruler in his hand." She did not weep. She folded the paper along its creases and slid it into the inside pocket of her coat, next to the compass where the two things rode together over her heart. Then she rolled her spare shirt and her wool stockings and Silas's leather roll of charts into her saddlebag alongside the food, and she reached up and took down her father's second-best rifle from its pegs above the mantel. He had said, "Take the roan." He had not said, "Leave the rifle." She considered, standing there with the weight of it across her arm, that a person who left a house in this particular manner might not, in plain truth, be coming back by Sunday, or by any other named day. Then she put the thought away, because it was not yet a thing she needed to answer. She went out through the kitchen door and let the latch fall, with the soft, small sound it had always made. And she crossed the yard in the blue dark to the barn, where the roan mare stood awake and quiet in her stall. She saddled by feel, wanting no lantern, and led the mare out through the gate and mounted in the road. Once, she looked back at the single square of window where the kitchen lamp still burned behind Verna's turned back. Then she put the mare up the wagon track toward the creek and did not look again. The track followed the water up through the lower pastures for the first 2 miles, and Della rode at a walk, because the mare had not yet warmed, and because she herself was still gathering the shape of the day into her chest and did not wish to hurry it. The dark thinned by degrees. The ridge on her right went from black to charcoal to the color of wet iron, and the ponderosas along its spine separated one from another as the light came up behind them. And somewhere above her a magpie called and was answered from farther up the draw. The air held enough cold that her breath and the mare's breath rose together in twin clouds and were left behind. She passed the smithy at the mouth of the creek without stopping. It stood shut and dark, its ridgepole beginning to sag, and she promised herself that when she came down again, whenever that proved to be, she would put a straight edge to it, because Silas would not have wanted the building to fall in on his forge. Then the wagon track narrowed to a trail, and the trail began to climb, and by full sunrise she was 3 miles above the ranch, and the country had begun to change its face. The grass grew thinner and paler. The lodgepoles closed in on either hand, straight and cold and close set, and the light came down through them in long, clean bars that slid across the mare's shoulder as she walked. Della drew the compass out from beneath her shirt and let it hang on its lanyard over the outside of her coat, where she could glance at it, and at the first flat rock she came to, she spread Silas's charts across her knee and studied them. The park was drawn as an oval 4 miles long, opening to the north, the creek running down its center, and the little square with its flag sat on the west side of the water, halfway up, on the low bench above the stream. She rolled the chart and rode on. The trail crossed the creek twice on gravel bars where the water ran cold and clear over the mare's fetlocks. And once she dismounted and led the roan across a slope of loose scree where the winter had washed the path away entirely. By the middle of the afternoon, her thighs burned, and the flat place above her belt had begun to ache, and she stopped in a small clearing to eat one of the biscuits and drink from the creek and let the mare crop what dry grass she could find. She did not build a fire. She sat with her back against a lodgepole and closed her eyes for the space of perhaps 100 heartbeats, and she thought of the $200 written down on the paper in her coat, and thought that it was not a small sum and not a large one, that it was most of all a sum arrived at without her. Then she opened her eyes, tightened the mare's cinch, and rode on. It was on the far side of that clearing, where the trail lifted over a shoulder of rock, that she found the first sign that she was not the only person to have set a purpose on this country. A cedar stake had been driven fresh into the ground beside the trail, its wood still pale and bleeding sap, and burned into its flat top with a running iron were two words she did not at once understand. Crane lumber. She sat the mare a long moment looking down at it. The stake was new. It had not weathered a single storm. Someone had come up this trail within the week, ahead of her, and had begun to lay claim to a valley that every soul below had spent a lifetime insisting held nothing worth the claiming. She had heard the name Crane at the ranch not 2 weeks past. A man had ridden into the yard on a tall bay horse with a saddle worth more than the horse, and had sat with her father on the porch through an afternoon, and had left with Garrett's face gone thoughtful and closed in a way she did not like. Hollis Crane, the name had been, a dealer in timber and land who was said to be buying up quiet the length of the range, betting on a rail spur that rumor kept promising and never delivered. He had wanted to talk about Skyhold Park. He had wanted, her father had said afterward and only once, to know whether the upper valley belonged to anyone who could sign a paper. Now here was his mark, driven into the ground 8 miles above the settlement, and Della understood that the question she rode to answer was no longer only her own. She left the stakes standing and rode on, but she rode differently after that, with her eyes moving more, and the ease gone out of her shoulders. The trail climbed for another 2 hours through a long shaded draw, and then it lifted her out over a low saddle, and the country fell away in front of her. And Della Whitcomb, 18 years old, sat her horse on the rim of Skyhold Park and looked down into it for the first time in her life. It was longer than the chart had made it seem. It lay below her in the slant of late afternoon light, like the palm of an open hand, the creek a bright vein down its center, the grass already greening in the sheltered folds, where the snow had gone off first, the timber standing dark on both ridges above. She let her eyes travel the length of it and saw no smoke, no fence, no cut stump, no wagon track, no sign that any person had ever set their weight down in that country and stayed. She thought, sitting there with the mare blowing softly beneath her, that some mapmaker had made his error in a warm room a lifetime ago and had never come to see, and that she would ride down and confirm the emptiness and turn back in the morning, with her answer folded up small. She rode down off the saddle by a long switchback of game trail, and the mare, smelling water and grass, went willingly. By the time she reached the creek bottom, the sun rode low on the western ridge, and the shadow of the timber had already thrown itself across half the park. She followed the water north on its east bank, walking the mare now, watching the far side for the low bench the chart had shown. She passed a stand of aspen just breaking into leaf, and a beaver slide grown over with willow, and a hollow where an elk had lain the night before and left the shape of its body pressed into the wet ground. Half a mile up, she saw the bench. It was not much to look at. It rose perhaps 12 feet above the creek on the west side, a shelf of grass and scattered pine backed by a steeper slope of timber that climbed to the ridge. She would have ridden past it without a second glance, except that Silas had marked it. And because Silas had marked it, she turned the mare into the creek and crossed to the west bank and rode up onto the shelf. And there, set back into the timber where young pines had grown up thick around it across the span of a generation, stood the walls. She stopped the mare and did not dismount at once. She only looked. The walls were of squared timber notched at the corners in the old style, laid in a rectangle perhaps 40 feet by 60, the logs weathered to the pale silver gray of long-standing wood, checked and cracked along their lengths with the slow work of many winters, but sound still in the corners where the notches held. They stood near 9 feet high. There was no roof. Along the top course, where a roof had once been carried, she could make out the mortise sockets where the beams had sat, and 2 or 3 of the beams themselves lay fallen inward along the base of the walls, gone dark and soft with rot. A gate opening stood in the south wall, wide enough for a wagon, its hinges nothing now but rusted iron pins driven into the jambs, the gate itself long gone to the seasons. Set into the north wall was a smaller doorway framed in heavier timber, and beyond it the half-fallen walls of a room built against the inner face. Silas, she said aloud, and the name came out of her rough because her throat had closed. You knew. You always knew. She dismounted and tied the mare to a young pine and walked in through the gate on foot. The ground inside was grass and pine duff, and the dark bones of the fallen beams and a scatter of hearthstones, long since knocked from their bed. She turned a slow circle and looked up at the top of the walls against the darkening sky. And when she spoke again, her voice was small inside that enclosure, and the walls held it a moment and gave it back to her changed. Every man along Cottonwood Fork who had ever said the fort was never built had been wrong, and had been wrong the whole of her life. And she was standing now in the middle of the proof of it. She made her camp that night against the inside of the south wall, near the gate, where the timber would break the wind, and where she could see the mare picketed on the grass beyond. She built a small fire of dry pine and boiled coffee in a tin cup and ate a biscuit and a slice of the salt pork. And she slept in her blanket with the rifle laid along her right side and the compass against her breastbone. She woke twice in the dark, once to a coyote calling from the east ridge, and once for no reason she could name. And both times she lay still and looked up at the pale top of the wall, standing against the stars, and felt the great age of the thing above her, and slept again. In the gray of the morning, she went over the fort inch by inch. She began at the gate and walked the inside of the wall clockwise, running her palm along the logs, testing the notches at the corners, counting the sockets where the roof beams had rested. 42 of them. She stepped over the fallen timbers and made her way into the room built against the north wall. Its doorway open and doorless, its floor, a bed of pine needles and the dry gray leavings of a pack rat that had wintered there some years and moved on. Against the back wall stood a stone chimney and hearth. The stones fitted dry without mortar, blackened at the throat where fires had burned. Above the hearth, set into the timber, ran a mantel shelf of a single squared piece of pine, worn smooth across its upper face by the passing of hands she would never know. She knelt at the hearth and cleared the needles away with her fingers. The hearthstones lay flat, 6 of them across the front, and the middle stone was larger than the rest, and set a little higher, as though it had once been meant to sit level and had since shifted in its bed. She rocked it with her fingertips and felt it move. She drew her belt knife and worked the blade down along the near edge and levered slowly. And the stone lifted a 1/4 inch, and with a second pry, it came up out of its seat entirely. Beneath it lay a hollow the size of 2 cupped hands, floored with a flat piece of tin cut from what had once been the lid of a lard bucket. And on the tin sat 2 things. One was a small canvas sack, closed at its neck with a leather thong, heavy in a way that told of metal inside. The other was an oilcloth packet tied with twine, flat and square, about the size of a folded letter. Della sat back on her heels and did not reach for either at once. She only looked at them lying there in the dark of the hollow, and she understood, in a way that raised the hair along her arms, that whoever had built these walls and roofed them and cooked at this hearth had also at some point lifted this same stone and set these 2 things beneath it and pressed the stone back down, and that no living hand had lifted it since. The dust of years had sealed the seam. She was the first. She took up the canvas sack first. She loosened the thong and poured its contents into her cupped palm and counted them out one by one against her knee. Gold pieces, $20 coins, worn smooth in the fields, but bright at the rims, where they had rubbed one against another in the dark. And among them a single smaller coin, a $5 piece, dropped in perhaps to round the whole to an even figure. 41 of the larger and the one small. $825, lying in the hand of a girl her family had priced at $200. She poured the coins carefully back and closed the sack and set it against her knee, and her heart was going hard. But it was not the gold that had set it going. It was the oilcloth. She took up the packet and untied the twine and unfolded the stiff cloth across the hearthstone, and inside lay a folded sheet of heavy paper, gone brown along its creases but not yet brittle, and a smaller thing wrapped in a scrap of red flannel. She unfolded the paper first. The writing filled most of one side pencils, in a plain square hand that had pressed hard enough to score the sheet, and she read it there on her knees, in the cold light coming down through the roofless walls. To whoever finds this, It began. My name is Adelaide Voss. I was born in the year 1820 in the state of Vermont, and I came into this country in the summer of 1849 with my husband, William Voss, who was a carpenter by trade and a soldier before that. We raised these walls in the 2 years that followed, meaning them for a stopping place along the freight road that was surveyed to come up this valley, and in the end did not come. William was lost in a fall from the north wall in the September of 1851 and lies buried beneath the tallest pine on the bench above the gate. I stayed on here alone the 11 years after him and kept the roof whole and ran a small trade with the men who passed through hunting and trapping, and I saved what I could. Against a day I meant to go back east and never did. I am 42 years old as I set this down, and I go down out of the valley tomorrow to the settlements, for my hands are no longer steady enough to hold a place through these winters alone. I leave $825 in coin, and this letter for whoever comes after me and finds this hearth. It is not a fortune, but it is honest money, saved out of 11 years of my own work. And I would sooner it went to a person who rode into this valley and saw these walls and knew what they were than have it lie under a stone until the stone itself is gone to dust. I hope you are young. I hope you have use for a place. The walls are sound. The chimney draws. The creek does not fail. God keep you, Adelaide Voss. The 4th of September in the year 1862. Della read it once through, and then she read it again slower, and when she reached the end, the second time, she sat very still and let the paper rest against her knee. Better than 20 years the letter had waited under the stone, and the hand that wrote it long stilled, and the words as fresh on the page as if the ink had dried that morning. She folded it back along its creases and set it carefully aside, and she unwrapped the scrap of red flannel. Inside the flannel was a brass pocket compass in a leather case. The case worn dark and soft, the glass scratched across its face, the needle when she laid it flat still swinging free and settling true to north. It was the twin of the one that hung against her breastbone. Not merely of a kind with it, not merely similar. When she drew out Silas's compass and laid to side by side on the flat of the hearthstone, she could not, for a long moment, tell which was which, and the two needles, settling, came to rest, pointing north, within the width of a single hair of one another. Her breath left her slowly. She looked from one compass to the other and back, and a cold understanding began to move through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. Two of a kind, made by the same hand, in the same shop, out of the same run of brass. The old man who had walked this high country with a surveyor's chain, who had marked this very fort onto a chart, with a small flag, and told her he had never met a soul who had seen it. The woman who had built these walls with her own husband, and traded with the men who passed through, and kept a compass in red flannel, against the day someone worthy would come. Della had believed her whole life that Silas had never laid eyes on this place. She held in her two hands the beginning of a proof that he had, and that his story and this woman's story had crossed somewhere in the years before Della was born and had left their mark in matched brass under a stone. She did not weep, though her eyes stung and the walls swam for a moment. She set her hand flat on the mantel above the hearth and held it there, the way a person greets someone who has just come into the room, and she said the woman's name aloud into the cold to make it real. Adelaide Voss. The pines took it and gave nothing back. She did not ride down that day, nor the next. She stayed at the fort 9 days on that first trip, and she did not touch the $825 beyond, counting it a second time and returning it to the sack, and setting the sack back in its hollow, with a folded square of oilcloth laid over it, and the stone pressed down. It did not feel like hers to spend. It felt like a thing held in trust across a gap of years, from a woman who had wanted it to matter, and Della was not yet certain what mattering would require of her. She took the letter with her, folded into the inside pocket of her coat, beside Verna's 6 cold lines, so that the two papers rode together, the one that had counted her out, and the one that had reached across 2 decades to count her in. Adelaide's compass she wrapped again in its flannel, and carried in the same pocket, on the far side of the letter, so that the two compasses hung close over her chest with only the wool between them. Through those 9 days she worked. She walked the walls a second time and a third. She cleared the pine duff out of the north room and swept the hearth with a whisk she made by binding dry grass to a stick. And something in the doing of it steadied her. She cleaned the chimney throat with a long green sapling and a rag tied at its end, and drew a thin fall of soot down onto the stones. On the fourth afternoon, she built a small fire on that hearth and watched the smoke climb straight up the flue and out above the open walls into the blue. And she said aloud that Adelaide had told the truth, the chimney drew, and the sound of her own voice saying, it did not feel foolish. She cut and dragged 4 young lodgepoles down from the timber above the bench with her father's second-best axe and laid them across the mortise sockets of the north room. The beginning of a roof. A promise made to herself in wood, because she did not have shakes or tar or canvas, enough to close it in, and she knew it. On the 10th day, she rode back down to Cottonwood Fork, with the letter and Adelaide's compass in her coat and the gold still under the stone. And she carried something else besides, something she had not carried up, the certain knowledge of what she meant to do, and the harder knowledge that a man named Hollis Crane meant to do the opposite, and that the empty valley every soul had ignored for a generation had become, in the space of a single week, a thing that 2 people wanted and only one could keep. At the ranch, she told her father plainly, standing at the kitchen table where the counting of her had been done, that the fort was standing, that she had found it exactly where Silas's charts had set it, and that she meant to go back up and put a roof over the north room and hold the ground before winter. She did not mention the gold. She said only that she would take the $200 set aside in Verna's note as her share, and would spend it on lumber and nails and shakes and tar paper and a small stove. And she asked for the loan of the roan mare for the season. Garrett looked at her across the length of the table a long minute, his coffee cooling in his 2 hands. You know Crane's men have been up there, he said at last. It was not a question. Stakes on the trail. He come back through here yesterday wanting my name on a paper, says the upper valley's got no owner. A muscle worked in his cheek. I did not sign it. You did not sign it yet, Della said. Something crossed her father's face then that she had not seen in years, a flicker of a man looking at a daughter and finding her further along a road than he had thought. He set the cup down. The mare's yours to keep, he told her. Not to borrow, yours. And I'll send one of the boys up in the wagon with whatever you buy at the mill. Verna, at the stove, nodded once and did not turn around. Roy and Emmett glanced at each other across the table, the way they had the morning she rode out. And this time it was Emmett, the younger and quieter, who spoke, saying only that he would drive the load himself. She rode to the mill on the wagon road the next day with the $200 in a leather pouch inside her coat, and she laid the matter before the miller, a broad, silent man named Josiah Smeese, 62 years old and widowed, who had known Silas Renner across the whole of both their lives and had shod horses at that same forge as a young man. Josiah heard her out with his arms folded, and when she had finished he was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing that told her the shape of what she was walking into. Crane's been to see me too, he said. Wanted to know, would I sell him timber off the Skyhold ridges once he had his paper. Told him I'd want to see the paper first. He unfolded his arms. There is no paper, girl. That's his whole game. There's nobody's name on that valley. So he means to put his own on it and let the law catch up after. A man like that don't build. He waits for a rail line and he clears the ground and he sells what's standing. You mean to build. I mean to hold, Della said. Adelaide Voss held it better than a dozen years alone. I mean to be the one who comes after. The name meant nothing to him, and she did not explain it, but something in the way she said it made the old miller look at her longer. He sold her 1,500 board feet of rough pine, 2 bundles of shakes, a keg of cut nails, a roll of tar paper, and a small sheet iron stove with 6 lengths of pipe, and he took $184 for the whole of it, and threw in a bag of stove bolts, because, he said, Silas would have wanted her to have them. The change she folded back into the pouch, $16 and some coin. And she thought, as she rode out, that Adelaide's gold still lay untouched under the stone, and that she had spent her own 200 and not the dead woman's trust, and that the distinction mattered to her more than she could have explained to anyone at that table she had left behind. Emmett drove the wagon up the valley trail in the last week of April, with Della riding ahead on the roan. He had never once in his life been up into Skyhold Park, and when he came over the low saddle on the rim and looked down and saw the gray walls standing on the bench, with the young pines grown thick around them, he drew the team up short and sat a long while on the box, without a word. Then he clucked the horses down the switchback. He stayed 4 days. He helped her set the ridgepole and lay the roof beams across the north room. And he cut the shakes to length with a froe he had thought to bring without being asked. And on the 5th morning, before he drove back down, he stood at the gate looking up at the plank where a sign might go and told her something she had not known. "Crane come to Pa again while you were up here the first time," he said, not looking at her, looking at the wall. "Offered him money for the home place. Said the range was changing and a smart man sold before the change came for him. Pa near took it. He shifted his weight. It's this that stopped him. You up here holding ground. Long as Skyhold Park's got somebody in it working, Crane can't tell folks the whole country's empty and there for the taking. You holding this is the only thing between Pa and that man's paper." He climbed to the box. "I didn't figure you knew that. Figured you ought to." He drove down, and Della stood at the gate a long time after the wagon was gone, turning the thing over. She had ridden up to answer a question about a map. She had found instead a dead woman's gift and a living man's greed pressed up against each other, and herself unasked, standing in the narrow ground between them, holding a place that turned out to matter to more people than she had ever imagined, caring where she stood. A week after Emmett went down, a woman rode up the trail, alone on a stout gray gelding, leading a pack mule loaded high. She was Iris Pelham, 47 years old, a midwife and herb woman from the Lower Creek, and the widow of a teamster killed in a runaway 6 years gone. She had known the name Adelaide Voss from an old account book of her husband's, and word had come up through Josiah Meese at the mill that a young woman was putting a roof on the old fort, and Iris had wanted to see it with her own eyes. She brought a sack of dried beans, 2 jars of honey, a paper of tea, and a bundle of pennyroyal and yarrow tied with string, and a piece quilt her own mother had sewn a generation back. She stayed 2 nights. She walked Della along the creek and showed her the plants that would keep through the winter dried. And on the second evening, sitting at the fire, she said the thing that Della was beginning to hear from every direction. "Crane sent a rider through the lower creek asking questions," Iris said, turning a coal with a stick. "Wanting to know who all had been up to the fort. Wanting names." She looked across the fire, and her face in the light was not frightened, only certain. "He's making a list, that man, of everyone who might stand up and say the valley was lived in. You want to know why folks are riding up here to help a girl they hardly know?" She set the stick down. "Because a place that a lot of people have set their hands to is a hard place for one man to say never belonged to anybody." She rode down without woe ceremony the next morning, and behind her, in the days that followed, others began to come. An old freighter named Orrin Kemp, 71 and retired, walked up the trail leading a burro loaded with a small anvil and a bellows and a set of tongs and a bundle of horseshoe stock, all of it out of Silas Renner's own smithy, which Kemp had bought at auction the year before for $11 and had been holding, he said, until he saw who came for it. He would take no money for any of it. He set the anvil on a section of squared pine inside the south wall, near the gate, and left the burro tied and walked back down. And before he went, he stood in the gate and looked up at the walls and said that Silas had spoken of this fort to him once, long years back, on a night when the old man had drunk enough to say things he otherwise kept shut, and had told him there was a woman up here who had built a thing meant to outlast her, and that he hoped to God somebody worthy found it before the timber went down. Della kept that. She kept all of it, the way she had learned to keep everything Silas ever gave her, and in the last week of that month, on an evening when the light lay green, along the ridge, and the creek ran loud with snowmelt. Below the bench, she stood at the gate and looked out down the valley she had ridden up to prove empty, and saw a rider coming north. Along the east bank of the creek, alone, sitting a tall bay horse on a saddle worth more than the horse. She had heard him described. She had seen his mark burned into cedar. She stood where she was and did not go for the rifle, and she let Hollis Crane come to her, up the bench and through the young pines to the foot of the gray walls a dead woman had raised, and she watched him rein in and look up at the roof she had begun to lay across the north room, and she saw the exact moment his face changed when the empty valley he had counted on turned out to have a person standing squarely in the middle of it, looking back. He sat his horse without dismounting, and that in itself told Della a great deal about the man. He looked at the walls the way a butcher looks at a steer, seeing not the thing itself but the weight it would render. And when his eyes came down at last to her, standing in the gate with her father's second-best rifle held, loose and unaimed across her forearm, he smiled in a way that never reached above his mustache. "You'd be the Whitcomb girl," he said, "the one that's been playing house up here." He let the bay step forward a pace onto the grass of the bench. "I'll save us both the afternoon. This valley's going to be logged inside 3 years, every stick of it, and the ground under these old logs is going to carry a rail siding. I've got surveyors coming through in June. Now, a girl with sense would take a fair price for her trouble and go home to her people before the trouble stops being fair." Della did not move the rifle. "There's no price on a thing that was never yours to buy," she said. "You can't purchase a valley from a person who doesn't own it, and you don't own it, Mr. Crane. Neither do I, but I'm the one living in it." His smile thinned. "Living in a ruin some drifter left a lifetime back doesn't put your name on a deed." "No," she agreed, and she took a step toward him so that the young pines no longer stood between them. But it wasn't a drifter, and she left more than a ruin. She had not planned to show him anything, had meant to give him nothing, but she found that the woman under the stone had made her braver than caution, aloud, and she drew from the inside of her coat the folded sheet of heavy brown paper and held it up so that he could see it was old, could see the pencil scoring the page, though he could not read a word of it from where he sat. "Adelaide Voss built these walls with her husband's own hands and held this valley better than a dozen years and left a record of every one of them. There's a grave under the tall pine above the gate with her husband in it. That's not empty ground, Mr. Crane. That's occupied ground, improved and lived on. And there are laws about occupied ground that a man with surveyors coming in June had better read before he burns any bridges." Something moved behind his eyes then, quick and cold, a recalculation. He had come expecting a frightened girl, and had found instead someone who spoke the language of paper, which was the only language he respected, and the discovery did not please him. He looked at the folded letter a moment longer than he meant to. "You've got no claim filed," he said. "Not yet. Then you've got nothing but a story." He gathered his reins. "I've broken men who had lawyers, girl. You want to stand in front of what's coming up this valley, holding a dead woman's grocery list. That's your affair. But I'll tell you this once, as a courtesy." He turned the bay, and over his shoulder the words came flat and unhurried. "The ground your daddy's ranch sits on isn't as settled as he thinks it is either. Water rights change hands. Notes come due. A smart man keeps his family where the trouble can't reach them. You might carry that home." He rode down off the bench without waiting for an answer, and Della watched the bay pick its way, back down the switchback to the creek bottom, until the timber took him. And only when he was fully gone did she let out the breath she had been holding, and feel the tremor come into her hands. It was not fear of the man. It was the recognition, sudden and complete, that he had just told her something without meaning to. He had come all this way, alone, to frighten off one 18-year-old girl with a rifle she had not raised. A man that's certain of his rail line and his surveyors did not ride 8 miles to threaten a person who did not matter. She mattered to him. The holding of these walls mattered to him, and that meant the walls were stronger than she had known. She went back inside the gate and slid the letter into her coat and stood over the anvil Orrin Kemp had left on its block of pine. running her thumb along its cold face, thinking. What Crane had said about her father's ranch was not an idle cruelty. He had said it the way a man says, a thing he knows to be already in motion. She thought of Garrett near taking Crane's money for the home place, of Emmett's warning that her holding this ground was the only wall between her father and that man's paper. And she understood now that the two fights were not separate. Crane meant to take the whole country, the upper valley and the lower ranches both, and he had let slip, in his contempt, that the taking of the ranch was further along than anyone below had guessed. She did not sleep well that night. She lay against the south wall with the fire banked low, and the two compasses over her heart, and turned Crane's parting words, this way and that, until the shape of them frightened her more than his surveyors. Toward morning, she made a decision that felt less like courage than like arithmetic. She would go down, not to the ranch, but to the settlement, to the land office in the county seat, 2 days' ride below the mill, and she would find out exactly what a person had to do to put a filed claim on ground that had been lived on and improved, and passed from a dead woman's trust into a living woman's hands. Adelaide had left her the walls and the gold and the letter. What Adelaide had not been able to leave her was a name on a deed, and Della had begun to understand that in the country Crane came from, the name on the deed was the only wall that ever truly held. She needed someone to hold the fort while she was gone, and the someone arrived, as such things had begun to, unlooked for. His name was Cole Tanner, and he came up the trail 2 days after she made her decision, a young man of 18 who had lost his father to a horse near the settlement that spring and had been living hand to mouth since, with a bedroll and an old single-shot rifle, and a question, whether she had work he could do for his keep. She looked at his hands, which were unmarked but willing, and at his eyes, which held steady when she met them, and she said yes. In the days before she left, he proved himself the kind who did a thing once he was shown it, and did not need showing twice. And she found she trusted him with the walls in a way she could not have explained, except that Silas had trusted her the same way once, on no better evidence than a stillness. She left him with the mare picketed and the beans and the honey and Iris's quilt, and the instruction to keep a fire in the north room and to let no man pass the gate who came without her leave. And she rode down on a borrowed horse Josiah Meese kept at the mill for such purposes. The land office in the county seat was a low brick building with a flag out front, and the clerk behind the counter was a narrow man named Pryor, with ink on his cuffs and spectacles pushed up into his hair. He heard her out with a patience that surprised her, and when she had finished laying the matter before him, the fort, the improvements, Adelaide's years, the roof she had begun, he took down a heavy-bound book and turned its pages and grew slowly grave. Here's the trouble, he said, tapping a column with a dry finger. Ground like you're describing, unpatented, unsurveyed, the government wants it settled, wants people on it. That's the whole idea of the law. A person who lives on it, improves it, files intent, proves up over 5 years. That person gets a patent for it near enough for free. That is exactly what the law is for. He looked up at her over the spectacles. But somebody's already been asking after Skyhold Park. Della's stomach dropped. Crane, a man representing a lumber concern, 3 weeks back, wanted to file a claim of his own on the same reach of the valley, said it was vacant. Pryor turned a page. I told him what I'll tell you. He can't file on ground that's occupied and improved by another party, not honestly. But he's got a lawyer now, and the lawyers filed a contest, arguing the fort's abandoned, that nobody's lived there in years, that the improvements are ruins and don't count. He set the pen down. It comes down to a hearing. The register hears both sides, weighs the evidence, decides who's got the better right. And I'll be plain with you, Miss Whitcomb, because you rode a long way to hear it plain. A hearing costs money, filing fees, a lawyer of your own if you're smart, witnesses brought down and put up. Crane's people have deep pockets and a year's head start on the paperwork. You've got a roof half built and a dead woman's letter. He closed the book gently, as though it were a thing that could bruise. The law is on the side of the person who lives on the land. But the law doesn't enforce itself. It has to be paid for. She rode back up toward the mill with those words settling into her, like cold water into a boot. The law is on the side of the person who lives on the land. That was the truest thing anyone had told her since she left her father's house. And it was also the cruelest, because it meant she had a right and would still lose it if she could not buy the proving of it. She thought of the $16 folded in the pouch inside her coat, all that remained of her 200. And she thought of the $825 in gold lying under the middle hearthstone, where she had not let herself so much as look at it since the day she found it. And for the first time since she had knelt at that hearth, the coins stopped being a dead woman's sacred trust and became something else entirely. They became a wall, the only wall she had that could stand against Crane's lawyer. The thought sat wrong in her the whole way up the valley. Adelaide had written that she would sooner the money went to a person who came into the valley and knew what the walls were than have it lie under the stone until the stone was gone. But she had not written spend it on lawyers. She had not imagined a man like Crane. And Della, riding up through the long shaded draw, with the fro-cut roof of the north room finally coming into view above the bench, could not make herself certain that turning Adelaide's gold into filing, fees, and a hearing was keeping faith with the woman or breaking it. She reached the gate at dusk and found Cole feeding a good fire and the mayor content. And she said nothing to him of the land office, and she lay awake that night with the weight of a decision she was not ready to make. It was made for her, in part, 3 days later, when Roy Doyle rode up the trail with a face like a closed fist and news from below. He had never come up before. That alone told her it was serious, that her elder stepbrother, 25, and married and running the North Pasture, the one who had always let Emmett do the driving and the helping, had ridden 8 miles into a valley he had shown no interest in. He got down stiff from the saddle and did not admire the walls or the roof or the anvil. He stood in the gate with his hat in his hand and told her that Crane had gone to her father again, and that this time Garrett had not near taken the offer. This time Crane had shown him a paper. A note, Roy said, and the word came out of him hard. Pa borrowed against the ranch 4 years back, drought year, to buy feed and keep the herd whole. Borrowed from the bank down at the county seat. Standard thing, everybody did it that year. A muscle jumped along his jaw the way it did in Garrett's. Crane bought the note. Bought it off the bank quiet, along with I don't know how many others up and down this range. He's holding paper on half the outfits on Cottonwood Fork, and nobody knew it till he started calling them in. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face she had never once seen turned toward her in all the years they had shared a table. Something that might have been the beginning of respect, and might have been simple fear looking for company. He told Pa the note's come due, told him he can pay it in full inside 60 days or sign the ranch over. And Pa can't pay it. Nobody could pay it, not in a season, not off cattle. Della sat down slowly on the block of pine beside Orrin Kemp's anvil. The fight she had thought was about a fort was about everything now. Crane had never cared about her half-built roof except as one loose thread in a country he meant to unravel entire. He had come up here to frighten her off the valley because the valley, held and lived in, was proof the range was not empty, and empty was the story he needed to tell. But he had a surer weapon than surveyors. He had her father's debt, and the debt of half the neighbors, besides, and he meant to take the lower ranches by the note and the upper valley by the contest, and stitch the whole country together under one name, his own. How long has Pa known? She asked. Told us last night. Verna's been up since, walking the floor. Roy turned his hat in his hands. He wanted me to tell you not to come down. Said there was nothing you could do, and no cause for you to lose your place fighting a fight that's already lost. Said you'd found something up here that was yours, and you should keep hold of it. He stopped, and his voice roughened. I don't think he's right. I think he's ashamed, and shame makes a man tell his children to stay clear so they won't watch him go under. But I'll carry his message on us. He wants you to stay up here and keep what's yours. Della looked past him, out the gate, and down the greening valley where the creek ran loud with the last of the snowmelt. and she thought about the $200 written on a note in Verna's slanting hand, the money that had counted her out of the family, as clean as a fence post. And she thought about a man who was now telling her, through the mouth of the stepson who had inherited what she had not, to save herself and let him drown. She thought that there was a kind of pride in her father that looked exactly like abandonment from the outside, and that she was perhaps the only person who had ever received both from him in the same season and could tell them apart. He counted me out of the ranch, she said, in ink. He doesn't get to count me out of saving it. Roy's mouth opened and then closed. Whatever he had ridden up expecting, it was not that. She rose from the block and walked to the north room and stood in its doorway a moment, looking at the hearth where the middle stone sat level in its bed with a dead woman's fortune beneath it. And she made the decision she had been circling for a week, made it all at once and completely, the way she did most things once she saw them clear. Adelaide Voss had saved that money out of years of holding a place against every reason to let it go. She had left it for a person who understood what the walls were. And the walls, Della saw now, had never been only timber. The walls were the refusal to be told a place was empty when people had worked and grieved and died to fill it. Spending Adelaide's gold to keep Crane from telling that lie about the whole country was not a betrayal of the woman. It was the truest keeping of her faith that Della could imagine. She turned back to Roy. "I'm coming down," she said. "Not to stay. I need to see Pa, and I need to see that clerk at the land office again, and I need to do it before Crane's lawyer sets a date I can't meet." She was already moving, gathering her coat, checking the compass on its lanyard from habit. "Cole stays here and holds the gate. You'll ride down with me. And Roy." She stopped and looked at him levelly. "When we get there, I'm going to ask you and Emmett to do a thing that'll take some nerve. And I need to know now whether you're the kind of men who'll do it, or the kind who'll find a reason not to." He straightened. Something in him seemed to decide. "Ask it," he said. They rode down together in the last light and the first dark, and Della told him on the trail what she had begun to see, that Crane's whole design rested on a single lie, that the range was empty and unclaimed and there for a strong man to take. Every note he had bought, every contest he had filed, every stake he had driven, all of it depended on the country agreeing to be told it belonged to no one. But it did belong to someone. It belonged to the people who had worked it, the Whitcombs and the neighbors on the notes, and Adelaide Voss under her tall pine and Silas Renner, who had walked it with a chain. And if those people stood up together and said so, on paper, in front of the register who would hear the contest, then Crane's lie would have to be told against a room full of the truth. "He's counting on everybody being ashamed and alone," she said, the roan picking its way down the dark switchback beneath her. "Ashamed of their debt, alone with their fear. That's how one man takes a whole country. Not by being strong, by keeping everybody else weak and quiet and looking at the ground." The creek murmured up at them from below. "I aim to get them looking at each other instead." They reached the ranch past midnight, and the kitchen lamp was burning, and Garrett was at the table, where he had done his counting. Gray-faced and older than his 52 years, with Verna standing behind him and Emmett in the corner, with his arms crossed. Garrett looked up when Della came through the door, and for a moment neither of them found anything to say. She had ridden out of this room a girl who had been priced and shelved. She came back into it something else, and he saw it, and the seeing seemed to cost him. "I told Roy to tell you to stay clear," he said. "He told me." She set her hat on the table between them, over the place where the note dividing the ranch had once lain. "I didn't listen. I've gotten out of the habit of doing what I'm told without asking why." A sound came from Verna that might have been the start of a reproach, and turned, at the last, into nothing. Garrett's hands were flat on the wood. "There's nothing to be done, Della. The note's real. The debt's real. Crane owns it fair, whatever else he is. 60 days, and I can't raise a tenth of it." His voice cracked along a seam she had never heard in it. "I built this place 30 years. I'll go down owing it to a timberman who never drove a nail in his life." "You'll go down owing it," she said, "if you go down alone. How many others are on his notes?" Garrett blinked. I don't know. Some. He's kept it quiet. Then we find out. She pulled a chair to the table, her own chair, and sat in it without being asked, and she saw her father register that too. You've been sitting here thinking this is your shame to carry by yourself. It's not. Crane bought a dozen notes or more, and every family holding one is sitting in a kitchen just like this one tonight, thinking the same thing you're thinking, that they're ruined and alone, and there's nothing to do but sign. That's the wall he's built. A dozen families too ashamed to talk to each other. She leaned forward. So we knock on doors. You and Emmett and Roy. You ride this range and you tell every family Crane's holding paper on that they're not the only one, that there's to be a hearing over Skyhold Park, and that a room full of neighbors swearing the country's lived in and worked, and theirs is the one thing a timberman with a lawyer can't buy his way past. Emmett came off the wall. A contest over the fort's got nothing legally to do with the notes on the ranches, he said. But he said it the way a man says a thing he wants to be argued out of. Not legally, Della agreed. But Crane's whole play is one story, that this country's empty and going to a stronger owner. And it's the same story under the notes and under the contest, both. Break the story in one place and it cracks in the other. A register who hears a valley full of people say Skyhold Park is settled and worked is going to look real hard at a man who claimed it was empty. And a bank that sold its paper to that same man is going to remember it did business with somebody the county's turned against. She looked around the table at the four faces caught in the lamplight. I can't promise it works. I can promise that signing quiet in the dark is the only thing that fails for certain. The kitchen was silent a long moment. Then Garrett Whitcomb, who had priced his daughter at $200 and set it down in ink, put his face in his hands, and when he took them away, his eyes were wet, and something in him had shifted onto new ground. I don't have the money for the lawyer your hearing needs, he said. I've got a mortgaged ranch and a herd Crane'll take with it. I have the money, Della said. Every head in the room turned. She had not meant to tell it yet, had meant to hold it close a while longer. But she saw that the moment wanted the truth entire, and she gave it. She told them, plainly and without ornament, about the middle hearthstone, and the hollow beneath it, and the canvas sack, and the $825 in worn gold that a woman named Adelaide Voss had saved out of years, alone in the high valley and left under a stone for whoever came after her, and understood what the walls were. She told them she had not touched a coin of it, that it felt like a trust and not a treasure, and that she had lain awake unable to decide whether spending it was faith or theft. And she told them what she had decided on the trail coming down. She left it so a place wouldn't die, Della said, and her voice was steady, though her hands were not. So the walls would go to somebody who'd hold them. Crane means to tell the whole country it's empty and haul it off in wagons. If Adelaide's money is what stops him, it's doing exactly what she saved it to do. I'd rather spend her gold keeping this country than let it sit under a stone while Crane hauls the country away over the top of it. Verna, who had stood silent through all of it, made a small broken sound and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Garrett stared at his daughter as though seeing a stranger who wore his dead wife's coloring, and when he spoke his voice had gone to gravel. That money's yours. Found on ground you hold. You'd spend it on my debt? On our debt, Della said, and on the neighbors, and on the valley, and on a hearing that says this country belongs to the people who worked it. Not on your debt, Pa, on the lie under your debt. She held his eyes. You wrote me down for $200 once. I'm about to spend 4 times that keeping the roof over the family that did it. I'd be obliged if nobody ever mentions the arithmetic again. It was Emmett who laughed first, a short, startled sound with something like grief and something like relief tangled up in it, and then Roy, and then, impossibly, Garrett himself, a broken, exhausted laugh that turned halfway through into something wetter. And Della understood that she had done, in one night, what the money alone could never have done. She had turned a table full of frightened, shamed, separate people back into a family that would fight in the same direction. That, more than the gold, was the thing Crane could not buy and could not survive. They did not sleep much. By the gray of the next morning, a plan had taken rough shape across the kitchen table. Argued and revised and argued again in a way that would have been unthinkable a day before. Della would take Adelaide's gold down to the county seat and file her intent on Skyhold Park and hire the best lawyer the town held. A man prior the clerk had named without quite naming. A lawyer who had beaten land grabbers before and disliked them on principle. Garrett and Roy and Emmett would ride the range. Every outfit Crane held a note on and carry the word. Verna, who knew every household from the wagon road up and had a memory like a ledger, would make the list of who held notes and who could be trusted and who might already have half sold to Crane out of fear. Della rode up to the fort one last time before she went down to the county seat, because she would not take Adelaide's gold out from under the stone without doing it with her own hands and her own understanding of what it meant. Cole met her at the gate with the fire going, and a question in his face he was too well-mannered to ask, and she told him only that she would be gone a week or better, and that the holding of the walls fell to him. She knelt at the hearth in the north room and lifted the middle stone the way she had the first time. And the hollow was as she had left it, the sack in its nest of oilcloth, the coins settling with a soft heavy shift as she drew it up into the light. She held it a moment in both hands, feeling the weight of a woman's years of work, and she found that the wrongness she had feared did not come. What came instead was a strange fierce certainty, as though the woman under the tall pine had been waiting all this time for exactly this, for the money to become a wall against exactly this kind of man. "I'm going to spend it, Adelaide," she said aloud to the cold hearth, to the mantle worn smooth by hands long gone, to the walls that gave her voice back to her changed. "Not on myself, on the thing you built it for. I hope that's right. I think it's right. And if I'm wrong, I'll carry the wrong myself and never lay it at your door." She set the stone back in its empty bed and pressed it level. She carried the sack out into the daylight and stowed it deep in her saddlebag beneath her spare shirt, and she did not look back at the north room as she rode out, because looking back was a habit she had broken the morning she left her father's house and had not taken up again. The county seat when she reached it 2 days later, with the gold riding heavy against the mare's flank. 3 streets of town than the settlement. 3 streets of frame and brick with a courthouse office beside it, and 2 doors down from that, a lawyer's shingle that read August Finch, attorney. Prior the clerk had said the name low, the way a man names a card he is not supposed to be holding, and when Della climbed the narrow stairs to Finch's office, she found a lean gray man of 60 in his shirt sleeves, surrounded by paper stacked to the windowsills, who listened to her whole account without once interrupting, and then sat back and looked at her over steepled fingers for a long time. "Hollis Crane," he said at last, as though tasting something spoiled. "I wondered when he'd overreach. A man buys up half a county's paper quiet. Sooner or later he trips on his own greed." He came forward in his chair. "You understand what you're walking into, Miss Whitcomb. This isn't one hearing. He'll contest your claim on the fort, and when that fails he'll drag the notes into court, and it'll be lawyers and filings and months of it, and he'll spend money trying to bleed you dry before a register ever rules. Do you have the means to see it through?" She set the canvas sack on his desk, over the papers, and loosened the thong, and let him see the worn gold catch the light. $825, she said. "Saved by a woman who held this same country against a whole lot of reasons to quit. I mean to spend every coin of it before I let Crane tell the world she never existed." August Finch looked at the gold, and then he looked at the girl who had carried it 2 days over the mountains, and something kindled behind his tired eyes that had not been there when she came up the stairs. "Put it away," he said. "You'll need most of it, and I'll take less than my usual, because I've been waiting years for somebody to hand me Hollis Crane on a hook." He drew a clean sheet of paper toward him and uncapped his pen. "Now, tell me about the grave under the pine, and the letter, and every soul who's set foot in that valley since you found it, and don't leave out the compass. Especially don't leave out the compass. Registers are made of people, Miss Whitcomb, and people don't remember filing dates. They remember a dead woman who left her life savings under a stone for a stranger, and two matched needles pointing north across a lifetime. That's not evidence. That's better than evidence. That's a thing a person can believe in. She talked until the light went long in the windows, and Finch filled page after page. And by the time she came back down the narrow stairs into the dusk of the county seat street, she had a lawyer and a filed intent and a hearing date 6 weeks out. And Crane had, whether he knew it yet or not, met the first wall he could not simply buy his way over. She stabled the mare and took a room over the town's one restaurant and lay awake in a real bed for the first time in weeks. And she thought, not of the hearing or the gold or even her father's debt, but of Adelaide Voss riding down out of the valley alone, with her hands gone unsteady, and of how the woman could not have known that the money she tucked under a stone would ride down these same mountains one day in a girl's saddlebag to break a man who was not yet grown when she wrote her letter. Some gifts take a lifetime to arrive, and some arrive exactly when the person who needs them has finally learned what they are for. The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest and the fullest of her life, and they did not go the way she had drawn them at the kitchen table, because nothing that involves a whole country full of frightened people ever goes the way it is drawn. Garrett and his stepsons rode the range as planned, and the word went out, and it did not catch the way Della had hoped. Not at first. The first 3 families they called on heard them out and said little and looked at the floor, because shame is a heavier thing to put down than she had reckoned, and because Crane had gotten to some of them already, with a quiet word about how neighbors who made trouble might find their own notes called first. Fear had teeth in that country, and Crane had spent a year sharpening them. But the 4th family stood up, an old rancher named Deakins, 70, and stubborn, and holding one of Crane's notes on a place he had homesteaded before the war, heard Garrett out on his porch, and then spat over the rail and said he'd be damned if he'd sign his life over to a man who bought his debt behind his back like a coward, and that if there was a hearing he'd ride to it and say so to the register's face. Deakins had sons and cousins, and a lifetime of standing in that country, and where he led others found the nerve to follow. The word that would not catch from a shamed neighbor caught like dry grass from a stubborn old man with nothing left to lose. And within a fortnight, the thing Della had gambled on began, slowly, to happen. The family stopped sitting alone in their kitchens. They started coming to each other's kitchens instead. Iris Pelham was worth 10 riders. In this, it turned out, because a midwife goes into every house in a country over the years and is trusted in all of them. And she carried Della's word from door to door, wrapped in the credit of a woman who had sat up with their sick and brought their children into the world, and where a Whitcomb was met with suspicion and Iris Pelham was let in and given coffee. Josiah Meese closed his mill for a day and rode the wagon road telling the freighters and the through travelers that Skyhold Park was claimed, and Adelaide Voss's name was on it, seeding the story wider than the range, so that by the time the hearing drew near, there were people in the county seat itself who knew about the grave under the pine and the letter under the stone, and the girl who had spent a dead woman's gold to fight a timber king, and public feeling, that slow, uncertain tide, had begun to turn against Hollis Crane in a country he had thought too frightened to turn. Crane felt it turning, and Crane struck back, because men like Crane always mistake the turning of the tide for a thing they can beat back with force. He could not intimidate Della off the valley, so he moved to make the valley worthless before the hearing could rule on who owned it, and the way he chose to do it nearly cost more than any note or contest. And it came, when it came, on a hot, dry afternoon in the last week before the hearing, on the wind, in the smell of smoke. Della was up at the fort when it started, having ridden back to relieve Cole and see the walls, before the county seat swallowed her for the hearing's duration, and she smelled it before she saw it, the sharp resin bite of burning timber carried down the valley on a wind out of the southwest that had been building hot and dry for 3 days. She came out through the gate and looked up the ridge above the bench and saw it, a thin gray column standing up from the timber a half-mile above the fort. where no lightning had struck, and no honest fire had any cause to start, spreading even as she watched into a line of smoke that leaned toward the walls on the wind. Cole was already at the creek filling every vessel they owned. It didn't start itself, he called to her, his young face gone hard beyond his years. I saw a rider up on the ridge not an hour past. Didn't come down. Just sat and looked and went back over the top. Crane's man. It had to be. A fire in dry timber a half-mile above a wooden fort, on a day the wind blew straight down onto it, was not an accident of nature, and both of them knew it, and there was no time to say it aloud. The fire wanted the walls. It wanted to do in an afternoon what Crane's lawyer might fail to do in a courtroom, to turn Adelaide's fort to ash, and Della's claim to a scatter of black timber the register could look at and call a ruin. And it wanted the timber above it and the grass below it, and if the wind held, the whole west flank of the valley, and Della understood in the first cold instant that she could not fight it alone. But she was not alone anymore. That was the thing Crane had never understood and would not understand until it broke him. She had spent 6 weeks turning a country full of separate frightened people into neighbors who came to each other's kitchens. And a country like that, when the smoke goes up, does not sit in its kitchens. She caught Cole by the arm as he turned back toward the walls with his buckets, and she made the choice that mattered most in that first minute, which was to get the youngest and least seasoned pair of hands out of the fire's reach and set to the one task that would bring everyone else. Leave the buckets, she told him. Take the fastest horse we've got and ride for the mill. Not the ranch, the mill, and tell Josiah to ring the bell and send word up every draw. You're no good to me breathing smoke on this ridge. You're worth 100 men on that trail. Go. He went because he had learned to do a thing. Once he was shown it, and she watched him take the switchback at a gallop and vanish into the timber. And she was glad past speaking that the boy was on the trail and not on the fire line, because whatever happened on this bench in the next hour, it would not happen to him. She stayed at the walls alone and did the only thing one person could do, which was to wet down the south and west walls and clear the grass and duff back from the timber's edge in a raw, scraped line, working until her hands blistered through her gloves, and the smoke stung her eyes to streaming, and the roar of the fire above came close enough to feel on her face. She soaked Iris's quilt in the creek and hung it over the driest reach of the west wall. She led the mare and the picketed stock down to the creek bottom and turned them onto the gravel bar where the fire could not reach them, and she watched the line of flame come down the ridge toward the walls a dead woman had built, and she did not run. Because running was a thing she had left in her father's yard along with looking back. She was not certain in that hour that the fort would stand, but she planted her feet on the scraped line at the timber's edge, with the wet quilt behind her, and the creek at her back, and the two compasses over her heart, and she made herself a promise as fierce and simple as the one she had made at the kitchen table, that Hollis Crane would not take by fire what he could not take by law, and that the first rider to come up that trail through the smoke would find not a ruin and not a girl who had fled, but Adelaide Voss's walls, and the woman who had chosen to hold them, side by side, unmoved. The first riders came out of the smoke while the sun was still a copper coin behind the haze. And they came not in ones and twos, but in a loose thundering line down the east bank of the creek. A dozen and more, with wet sacks and shovels lashed to their saddles. Josiah Meese's mill bell having done in an hour what Crane had spent a year trying to prevent. Deacons was at the front of them, 70 years old and riding like a man of 40, his old face streaked black already from the ride through the drift smoke. And behind him came his sons and his cousins and people Della had never met who held Crane's notes and had decided, when the smoke went up over Skyhold Park, that they would rather fight fire beside a girl than sign paper, alone in the dark. They did not wait to be told what to do. Deacons took one look at the scraped line Della had cut at the timber's edge and bellowed his people into it, and the valley that had stood empty of that kind of labor, for a generation filled in a matter of minutes, with the sound of shovels biting earth and the shouts of men and women widening her firebreak into something A wall of flame might actually be made to respect. Emmett arrived with the second wave, having ridden from the ranch the instant the bell reached him. And he came off his horse before it fully stopped and was beside her at the line with an axe, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that the work did not say better. The fire came down onto them in the last light, with a sound like a freight train that had left its rails. And for a stretch of time Della could not have measured. The whole west flank of the valley was a single roaring thing, and the people on the line became silhouettes cut black against it, beating and digging and throwing creek water in a fight that no one of them could have won, and that all of them together might. The wind was the thing that saved them. In the end, the same wind Crane's man had counted on to do his burning. It shifted near full dark, backing around to the north the way mountain wind will, when the day's heat lets go of the land, and it turned the head of the fire back onto ground it had already burned and starved there, and began to die. The line held. The scraped earth and the wet sacks and the labor of 30 people held, and when the true dark came down the fire had broken into a scatter of glowing pockets in the timber above the bench that the men walked down one by one through the night, and the walls Adelaide Voss had raised stood untouched on their shelf, soot streaked along the west face where Iris's quilt had steamed against the logs, but whole, and ringed now by the muddy trampled proof that a whole country had ridden into the smoke to keep them standing. Deacons found her at first light, both of them past speech with exhaustion, their clothes burned through with cinder holes. And he looked up at the gray walls in the dawn and then down at her, and what he said she would carry the rest of her life. A man sets fire to a country to prove it's empty, he told her, wiping his blackened face with a blackened hand, and all he does is show everybody living in it that it ain't. He spat into the ash. Crane just lost his hearing, girl, and he did it with a match. You watch. She wanted to believe him. She could not yet, because she had learned that a man like Crane did not lose so much as change the ground of the fight, and the fire that had failed to burn the fort had done something she did not expect, which she learned when Emmett came to her mid-morning, with a strange, careful look, and told her that one of Deacons's hands had caught the rider. Not caught him in the act, but a young hand named Pruitt, riding the ridge in the last light hunting spot fires, had come on a man afoot leading a lamed horse down the back of the mountain, a man who did not belong to any outfit on Cottonwood Fork, whose saddlebag held a can that had carried coal oil and a bundle of oiled rags, and who, when Pruitt braced him, had offered $40 in gold to be let go and had named, in his fear, the man who had paid him to climb that ridge with a can and a plan. Crane had not sent one of his own regular men. He had hired a drifter through a third party, the way careful men hire the doing of ugly things, meaning to keep his own hands clean of the smoke. But the drifter, held now in the mill's stout root cellar with Josiah Meese standing over him, had no such care for Crane's clean hands, and he had talked. Della rode down to the mill that afternoon on a borrowed horse, every muscle in her screaming from the night's work, and she stood in the cool dark of the root cellar and looked at the man who had tried to burn Adelaide's walls to ash. He was a poor, frightened creature, in truth, not a villain but a tool, thin and unshaven, and he told his story again in front of August Finch, who had ridden up from the county seat the moment the news reached him, and Finch wrote every word of it down in a hand that grew more delighted with each line. He'll swear to this, Finch said afterward, in the mill office with the door shut, tapping the pages, in front of the register, in front of a judge, in front of God. Arson to destroy improvements pending a land contest. Miss Whitcomb, do you understand what your friend Crane has done? His gray eyes were bright with a hunting joy. A land dispute is a civil matter, argued on paper, decided on evidence. A man might lose one and lose nothing but the land. But this, he struck the pages with the back of his hand. This is a crime. This is the kind of thing that doesn't just cost a man his claim. It costs him everything he's built the claim on. Every note he holds, every deal he's made, every judge who took his word, all of it comes into question the moment it comes out. He sent a man up a mountain with a can of oil. He sat back. He didn't change the ground of the fight. He handed us the whole field, but Finch was too old a hand to celebrate before the cards were down, and he sobered fast. Provided, he said, that this man is still willing to swear to it in 6 days when the hearing opens, and provided Crane doesn't reach him first. Crane will know by tonight his man's been taken. He'll move. The question is which way. He gathered the pages and buttoned them into his coat, close against his body. These don't leave my person until they're read into the record. A confession in a drawer is worth exactly nothing the morning it goes missing. The days that followed had the taut, sleepless quality of a country waiting for a storm it can see building on the horizon. Crane did move, and he moved the way Finch had feared, and then some. Word came up the wagon road that he had gone to the county seat himself and hired a second lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man out of Denver named Ashcroft, with a reputation for making inconvenient witnesses inconvenient to find, and that the two of them together had begun to spread a counterstory through the town, that the fire had been an accident of the dry season, that the drifter was a known liar who would say anything to save his own neck, that the whole tale of arson was a fabrication got up by a scheming girl and a broke old rancher to steal a valley they had no right to. Money bought newspaper ink in that country as easily as it bought notes, and within days there were people in the county seat who had never set foot on Cottonwood Fork repeating Crane's version as gospel, and the tide of public feeling that Deacons had sworn was turning began, under Crane's gold, to slosh uncertainly back the other way. The blow that nearly broke them came 4 days before the hearing, and it came, as the worst blows do, from the direction of trust. Della had ridden down to the county seat to go over the witness order with Finch, and she was in his cramped office over the street when a boy brought up a note, and Finch read it, and the hunting brightness went out of his face like a lamp pinched dark. He read it twice, set it down on the desk between them, and pressed the heels of both hands against his tired eyes. Deacons has pulled out, he said. The words made no sense to her. Deacons, who had led the riders into the smoke, who had spat in the ash and told her Crane had lost with a match. Pulled out of what? Of testifying. Of all of it. Finch slid the note toward her, and she read the few crabbed lines in an unfamiliar hand, a message relayed from the lower creek. Crane had gone to Deacons the day before, not with threats, but with something crueler and more precise. He had called the old man's own note, the note on the place Deacons had homesteaded before the war, and he had done it in a way that gave Deacons a single grim choice, that he could stand up at the hearing and swear against Crane and lose his home in 30 days, for certain. The note called in full and no mercy, or he could stay home, keep his mouth shut, and Crane would let the note ride another year. He's 70 years old, Finch said quietly. He's got a wife older than he is, and a place he's held 50 years, and Crane offered to let him keep it or lose it, and all it cost was his word. I can't fault the man, Miss Whitcomb. I've seen stronger men break on a smaller wheel. Della sat with the note in her hands, and she understood that Crane had found, at last, the weapon that worked. He could not frighten her off the valley, could not burn it, could not buy her, but he could go to every frightened family one by one, private and quiet, and offer each of them the same devil's mercy, their own home, for their silence. And he had the notes to make the offer real. And a country that had been ready to stand together in the abstract found the standing much harder when the cost was your own roof, this month, for certain. One by one, Della saw, Crane would peel her witnesses away, not with fear of what he might do, but with the promise of what he wouldn't. And by the morning of the hearing, she might stand up in that room with a lawyer and a letter and a confession, and no living neighbor willing to say a word beside her. How many will he reach? She asked. All of them he holds paper on, given time. He hasn't got time to reach all before the hearing, but he'll reach enough. Deacons was the spine of it. Others will follow where Deacons led, in this as in the fire. Finch looked at her, and for the first time since she had climbed his stairs with a sack of gold, the old lawyer looked genuinely afraid. I'll be straight with you, because you've never wanted it any other way. We can still win on the Facine confession alone if that man swears and holds. But Crane knows it, which means the one witness he most needs to reach isn't the ranchers. It's the drifter in Josiah's cellar. If Crane gets to him, buys him, or frightens him into recanting, we've got a letter, a compass, and a burned girl's word against a timber king. With 2 lawyers and half the county's paper in his pocket, he stood. Go back up the mountain. Keep that man alive and honest, and where nobody can touch him. Everything turns on him now. She rode through the night to reach the mill by dawn, and she found the situation worse than she had left it, because Crane's reach had a longer arm than any of them had credited. Josiah met her at the mill door gray-faced, and told her that a man had come the evening before, well-dressed, a stranger, asking after the prisoner's health, offering money to the mill hands to look the other way for an hour, and that one of the younger hands had nearly taken it before Josiah caught the drift of it and ran the man off. The drifter himself in the had gone from frightened to terrified, understanding now that both sides of a war he had blundered into had reason to want him, one to make him speak and one to make him silent. And a man that frightened, Della knew, was a man who might recant from pure animal fear the moment he decided which side was more likely to hurt him. She went down into the cellar alone and sat on an upturned crate across from him in the lantern light. And she did not threaten him, and she did not bribe him, because she had watched Crane try both and understood by now that fear and money were the currencies of the man she was fighting, and that, if she meant to beat him, she would have to spend a coin he did not carry. She simply talked to the man. She asked his name, which was Harmon, and where he was from, which was a hard luck string of places that had none of them held him. And she told him, plainly, what would happen to him if he swore true, and what would happen if he ran or lied, not as a threat, but as the honest map of a country he had wandered into blind. You climbed that ridge with a can of oil for $40, she said, and you did it because a man with money told you to, and you figured a burned-up fort in the mountains was nobody's grief and no skin off you. But that fort was built by a woman who held this country alone for years, and she left everything she had under a stone so it wouldn't die, and you were paid 2 days' wages to burn her whole life to ash. She let that sit in the lantern light. I'm not going to lie to you about it being safe to tell the truth. It's not. Crane's people will come for you, before the hearing and maybe after. But I'll tell you the one thing the money can't. If you swear true, you'll be a man who did one right thing in a life that sounds like it's been short of them. And if you take his coin and recant, you'll spend whatever's left of your days, knowing you helped a rich man burn a dead woman's house down twice. She stood to go. You've got till the hearing to decide which man you'd rather be. I can't make it for you. Nobody can. That's the whole weight of being a person, Harmon. Nobody gets to carry it for you. She left him with a blanket and a hot meal, and Josiah's word that the cellar would be watched around the clock by men who could not be bought. And she rode up to the fort, with the thing she had not said to Finch sitting cold in her chest, which was that she no longer knew if they would win. The confession hung on one frightened stranger's nerve. Her witnesses were being peeled away, one, by a mercy crueler than any threat. And Crane, who had misjudged her at every turn, had finally found the shape of the fight that suited him. Patient and private and paid for, a war of attrition against people who could not afford to lose even once. At the fort she found a small, unlooked-for grace waiting, the kind that arrives, as Adelaide's gold had, exactly when the person who needs it has run nearly empty. Iris Pelham had come up in her absence, and with her had come 3 families from the lower creek, not to fight and not to testify, but simply to be there, to mend the fire-scorched chinking, and cook a great pot of beans over the hearth, and let their children play in the grass of the bench below the walls where an elk had once lain, because Iris had understood something that Della in her exhaustion had lost sight of. The people could not all afford to stand up in a courtroom against their own notes. But they could come to the walls. They could put their hands on the thing they were fighting for, and remember, in their bodies, why it was worth the fear, and a country reminded of what it stood to lose was a country harder for Crane to peel apart one frightened kitchen at a time. Della stood in the gate and watched a family's small daughter chase a grasshopper through the greening grass below the fort, laughing in the last of the daylight, and something in her that had gone brittle these last days bent instead of breaking. She thought of Adelaide writing that she hoped whoever came after would have use for a place, and she understood that this exactly was the use, that the walls were not a fortune or a claim or even a home, but a reason for scattered frightened people to gather and remember they were not alone, and that Crane, for all his notes and lawyers, had never once in his life built a thing that made people gather, and never would, because a man who saw a country only as weight to be rendered could not imagine why anyone would ride into smoke to save a ruin. Iris came to stand beside her at the gate as the light went long. "Deacon's pulling out," the older woman said, not asking, because word traveled the lower creek faster than any rider. "It's got the others scared. Won't lie to you about that." She watched the child in the grass. "But scared isn't the same as beat. I've sat with women in the worst hours of their lives, and I'll tell you what I've learned. People find nerve in company they'd never find alone." Deacons found his in the fire, with 30 people around him. He lost it in his kitchen, by himself, with Crane's note on the table. She turned to Della. "So don't let it be fought in kitchens. Whatever this hearing is, make it a place where they're all together, where they can see each other's faces. Crane wins them one at a time in the dark. You beat him all at once in the light, or you don't beat him." It was the truest strategy anyone had given her, and it settled the last uncertain piece of the thing into place. She could not stop Crane from calling the notes. She could not promise a single frightened rancher his home, but she could make the hearing itself into the one place Crane could not follow them. A public room, in the light, with the whole country watching, and each neighbor able to see that they were not the only ones standing. And she resolved that night to fill the county seat courtroom so full of Cottonwood Fork that no one in it would feel alone enough to fold. The morning she rode down to the county seat for the hearing, the fort behind her held more life than it had known in a generation. Cole and two of Deacon's grandsons left to guard the walls. Iris's family still mending and cooking. The confession safe in Finch's coat, and the confessor safe in a wagon under Josiah's guard. Being brought down to the courthouse in the center of a crowd, too large and too watchful for any of Crane's people to reach. She wore her one good shirt, saved clean in the saddlebag through all of it, and the two compasses over her heart, and in her coat she carried Adelaide Voss's letter, brown along its creases, the thing that had started all of it, and she rode into the county seat at the head of a line of riders that grew at every crossroad, families falling in from the wagon road and the lower creek and the side draws, until by the time the courthouse came in sight, she led a column that stretched back farther than she could see, and the streets of the town were full of people come to watch a girl who had spent a dead woman's gold fight a timber king. The courtroom could not hold them all. That was the first small victory, and it was Iris's victory as much as hers, because a hearing that had been meant to be a quiet civil matter argued between two lawyers had become, by the sheer press of Cottonwood Fork, a public reckoning that spilled out the doors and down the courthouse steps into the street. And the register who came out to open it, a careful gray official named Holloway, who had expected an ordinary morning's docket, took one look at the crowd and understood that whatever he ruled would be ruled in front of the whole county and remembered. Crane was there before her, at a table on the near side with his two lawyers, Ashcroft Slick and Denver Tailored beside him, and the local man on his other hand. And he did not look at Della when she came in, which told her more than a glare would have. He looked instead at the crowd, counting it the way he counted everything. And she watched him make the tally and find it larger than he had planned for, and watched the first flicker of real uncertainty cross a face. She had only ever seen wear contempt. He had built his whole design on people being alone. He had not reckoned on August Finch and Iris Pelham and a mill bell and a fire understanding. Between them, exactly how to make people unalone. And the room full of watching neighbors was a variable his gold had not been able to buy off. Finch laid it out first, and he laid it out plain, because he had told her a room of ordinary people remembers a story and not a filing date, and he gave them the story. He told the register of a woman named Adelaide Voss, who had come into an empty valley with her husband and raised walls with their own hands, who had held that ground alone after she buried him beneath the tallest pine, who had traded honestly and kept a roof whole through winters that would have killed most men, and who at the last had ridden down out of the mountains and left under a hearthstone every dollar she had saved, 825 of them, for whoever came after and understood what the walls were. He told of a girl who had ridden up to settle a mapmaker's argument and found instead a trust 2 decades old, and who had not spent a coin of it on herself, but had carried it down these same mountains to defend the valley against a man who wanted to prove it empty. He entered Adelaide's letter into the record and read it aloud in the silent room. The whole of it. The pencil-scored words of a woman long dead filling a courthouse full of the living, and when he reached the line about the walls being sound and the chimney drawing and the creek not failing, Della saw more than one weathered face in that crowd turn wet, because every rancher in the room had held a hard place through hard years and knew exactly what those words had cost the woman who wrote them. Then Ashcroft rose for Crane, smooth and unhurried, and did what Finch had warned he would do, which was to grant every ounce of the sentiment and deny that it meant a thing. A moving story, he allowed, a touching relic. But sentiment was not law, and the law asked one question only: whether the ground had been continuously occupied and improved, or whether it had stood abandoned, a ruin, for the better part of 2 decades between the day Adelaide Voss rode away and the day this girl happened upon it. 20 years and more, he said, letting the number ring, of no one living there, no one improving it, no taxes paid, no claim filed, a fort fallen to rotten pack rats, until a dispossessed rancher's daughter, with no inheritance of her own, saw a chance to manufacture a claim out of a dead woman's leavings. He was good. Della had to grant him that. He made her sound not like a woman keeping faith with the dead, but like an opportunist dressing up a land grab in a stranger's letter. And she felt the uncertain tide in the room shift under his voice, felt the watching neighbors wonder, for the first time, if the story they had ridden in to support was as clean as they had believed. It was then that Crane made the mistake that ended him, and he made it out of the same contempt that had cost him at every turn, because a man who believes the world is only weight and fear cannot conceive that anyone might act from anything else. And so he reached, when the tide seemed to turn his way, for the weapon that had always worked. Ashcroft called it prudent to note, for the register's consideration, that several parties who had been expected to speak for the girl's claim had, on reflection, declined to appear, and that their absence spoke to the true weight of her support. He meant deacons. He meant the peeled-away witnesses, the frightened kittens, and he said it with a small, satisfied glance toward the crowd, a glance that was almost a dare, reminding every family in that room who held one of Crane's notes that he was watching that he saw who stood and who sat, that the mercy he offered in private had a price he could exact in public, and the dare, meant to cow the room, woke it instead. Deacon stood up. He rose from the middle of the crowd where he had come. He had said, only to watch. 70 years old with his home hanging on his silence, and the whole room turned to him. And Crane's face, for one naked instant, showed something Della had never seen on it, which was surprise. The old man's voice was not loud, but the room had gone so still that it carried to the steps and the street beyond. I told this man's people I'd keep my mouth shut, Deacon said, so I could keep my place. He called my note and offered to let it ride if I sat home quiet. And I did mean to. I'm old, and I'm tired, and I've got a wife to think of, and a home's a hard thing to gamble. He turned slow, to face Crane directly across the crowded room. But I sat in my kitchen these 3 days, and I thought about that fire, and about a can of oil packed up a ridge to burn out a girl who never did him a lick of harm. And I found I'd rather lose my place standing up than keep it sitting down. A man that'll burn a country to own it has already told you what he'll do to you the day you're no more use to him than she was. He looked at the register now. I'll swear to what Crane offered me, And why? Take that down. And when he calls my note for saying it, I'll want that took down too. So the whole county knows exactly what kind of man was buying up its paper in the dark. The room broke then, not into chaos, but into a low rolling murmur. That was the sound of 100 frightened people discovering all at once that they were not frightened alone. And Della watched it move through the crowd like wind across the high grass of the park, watched a second man stand, and a third, watched the peeled-away witnesses find in Deakinson's is courage the nerve they had lost in their kitchens, exactly as Iris had said they would, because people find in company what they cannot find by themselves, and Crane had gathered them all into one room and handed them each other. Ashcroft was on his feet, trying to stem it, calling for order, calling the outbursts improper, but the Register Holloway let it run. And the look on Holloway's careful gray face was the look of a man watching the true weight of a thing become visible in front of him. Crane leaned to Ashcroft and said something low and urgent, and Della saw the Denver lawyer's smooth composure crack for the first time, saw him shake his head at his client in a way that said the ground had moved too far to be moved back. But Crane had one card left, the card he had held from the start, and he was not a man to lose without playing it. He rose himself, over Ashcroft's restraining hand, and addressed the Register directly, his voice pitched to carry over the murmur, cold and reasonable, and utterly certain of its own weight. The sentiment in this room was very fine, he allowed, but it changed nothing about the paper. He held valid notes on a dozen outfits in this valley, purchased lawfully, due and payable. He held a lawful contest against an unfiled and abandoned claim. Whatever these people felt, whatever a dead woman had written, the law was the law, and the law was on the side of the man who held the paper, and he would have this valley and these ranches by that paper whether the county loved him for it or not. Because in the end, he said, a country runs on debt and deeds, not on letters under stones. And it was into the silence, after those words, before the Register could answer, that August Finch rose with the drifter's signed confession in one hand and a second paper beneath it, and told the court that he had two matters yet to enter into the record, the first speaking to whether the man across the room was fit to hold any paper in the county whatsoever, and the second to whether he would soon be in a position to hold anything at all. He read the confession first. He read it slowly, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who knows the words need no help from him. The whole account of a drifter named Harmon hired through a third party and paid $40 in gold to carry a can of coal oil up the ridge above an occupied homestead and set the timber alight with the wind blowing down onto the walls. And as he read, the murmur in the room changed its character, curdled from sympathy into something harder. Because there is a difference between a man who grabs for land and a man who would burn a woman out to get it, and the crowd of Cottonwood Fork felt the difference move through them like a cold draft under a door. Harmon himself was brought in, thin and shaking, and holding to the truth by the frayed thread Della had left him with, and he pointed across that packed room at Hollis Crane and named him in a voice that cracked but did not stop, and no smooth word out of Ashcroft could put back into the bottle what one frightened honest man had just poured out of it. But it was the second paper that finished it, and the second paper was not Finch's doing at all. It had come to him the evening before, carried by a rider from the county seat, and it was a dispatch off the telegraph wire that ran into the depot at the rail junction 40 miles south. And it bore a piece of news that Crane, buried in his contest and his notes and his hired fire, had not yet heard, because he had spent the week making enemies instead of reading his mail. The rail company that Crane had staked his whole design upon, the spur he had bet a county's worth of bought paper would come up this range and make his timber and his cleared ground worth a fortune, had that week filed its surveyed route with the territorial office. And the route did not come up Cottonwood Fork at all. It ran west of the divide, through a lower pass, a full day's ride from Skyhold Park, and it would never come nearer to Crane's stakes and Crane's notes than the far side of a mountain range. Finch read the dispatch into the record in the same flat voice, And Della watched the thing land on Crane, not all at once, but in stages, the way a wall comes down, and she understood the whole architecture of the man's ruin in the space of a breath. Every note he had been bought against the certainty of that rail line. Every dollar he had borrowed to buy them, and he had borrowed. A man does not purchase half a county's paper out of his own pocket, had been borrowed against the same certainty. He had made himself the largest debtor in the country in order to become its largest creditor, and he had done it on a bet that had just that very week come in against him. The valley he had tried to burn was worth to the railroad exactly nothing, and the notes he held on the ranches of Cottonwood Fork were worth only what the ranchers could pay, which was little, and the debts he had run up to buy them were worth precisely as much as ever, which was all of it, and due. You asked the register to weigh paper against a letter under a stone, Finch said, and for the first time all morning there was something almost gentle in it, the gentleness of a man who no longer needs to raise his voice. So let us weigh it. You hold notes on a dozen families who mean to fight you now in the open, before a county that has heard how you fight, and you hold them against loans of your own that came due on a rail line that is not coming. The letter under the stone will outlast every deed you own, Mr. Crane, because the woman who wrote it built something, and you only ever bought things, and the day the buying stops, a man who never built has nothing left to stand on. Crane did not answer. There was no answer to make. Ashcroft was already gathering his papers, with the brisk detachment of a man putting distance between himself and a client who could no longer pay him. And the local lawyer had gone pale, and the register Holloway, who had come in expecting to weigh a girl's sentiment against a timber concern's resources, looked out over a packed and murmuring room and made the only ruling the morning had left him room to make. He would take the confession and the sworn statements into the record. He would refer the matter of the fire to the county attorney for prosecution, and on the contest itself, the question of who held the better right to the ground in Skyhold Park, he found no contest at all, for the party challenging the claim had come before him with unclean hands, and the party defending it had shown occupation, improvement, and a chain of trust reaching back 2 decades and better, and he would recommend Della Whitcomb's claim be carried to patent. She did not remember afterward the sound the room made. She remembered only that Emmett had a hand on her shoulder, and that her father was somewhere behind her with his hat crushed in both fists and his face wet and unashamed of it, and that across the room, Hollis Crane rose from his table and walked out through a crowd that parted for him, not in fear now, but in the way people step back from a thing that has already fallen, and that not one soul said a word to him as he went, which was, she thought, the truest measure of what he had lost. He had wanted to own a country. He would leave it owing more than any family in it, and he would leave it alone. And a man who had made himself alone on purpose his whole life had no practice at bearing it. The unwinding of Hollis Crane took longer than his falling, as such things do, and Della was not present for most of it, because the law grinds slow, and she had a valley to hold and a winter coming. The county attorney's prosecution moved through the summer. The banks that had lent Crane the money to buy his paper, hearing which way the wind had turned, called their own loans, as ruthlessly as he had meant to call his, and the notes he held on the outfits of Cottonwood Fork were sold off in the settlement of his debts, bought back in ones and twos by the very families that owed them, at pennies on the dollar, because no one else in the territory wanted paper on hard-scrabble ranches at the dead end of a valley the railroad had passed by. Garrett Whitcomb bought back his own note in August for less than the price of a good horse, and he brought the canceled paper up to the fort himself, alone, on a gelding, with the document folded in his breast pocket, and he did not hand it to Della so much as set it on the mantel beside the 2 compasses, the way a man lays down a thing he has carried too long and is glad to be rid of. He was 53 that summer, and he stayed 2 nights, and he said very little, which was his way. But on the morning he left, he stood at the gate, looking up at the plank above it, where Della had by then hung a hand-lettered sign, and he read it twice, and something worked in his weathered face that he did not have the words for, and did not try to force. The sign read Voss Crossing, and below it, in smaller letters, in the same careful hand Della had somehow, without meaning to, learned from a dead woman's letter, until her pencil made the very shapes that Adelaide's had made. It read Peen Creek, Skyhold Park, and beneath that the single line, in memory of the woman who built the walls and left the trust beneath the stone. Your mother's marriage portion, Garrett said at the last, with one boot in the stirrup and his eyes fixed on the sign so he would not have to fix them on his daughter. The $200. That's what it was. Verna wrote it down as a share, because a share is a thing that can be set on a table and divided, and I let her, because it was easier than saying out loud that I did not know how to give a daughter a piece of a thing I only knew how to leave to sons. He swung up into the saddle. It was never that you were worth less. It was that I never learned the arithmetic for what you were worth. You went and did the sum yourself. He looked at her then, one clear, unguarded moment. You spent $200 keeping the roof over people who wrote you out of it. I have thought about that every day since, and I will think about it until they put me under a pine of my own. Whatever else I got wrong, and it is a long account, I raised a daughter who knew the difference between what a thing costs and what it is worth. I do not know where you learned it. It was not from me. He rode down before she could answer, which was a mercy to them both, and Della stood at the gate and watched him go, and she did not look away until the timber took him, because some partings are worth the watching, even when the leavings were not. She built through that summer and the summers after. The 4 young lodgepoles she had laid across the north room in the first week became a true roof, and the north room became a kitchen with Adelaide's hearth at the heart of it. And against the west wall she raised a second room with the sheet iron stove from Josiah's mill, and Cole Tanner, who had ridden for the bell and been kept off the fire line and never once resented it, learned to draw a horseshoe out of a bar on Orrin Kemp's anvil and to split a shake off a bolt of pine with a single true stroke. And he stayed because he had found in the holding of the walls the same thing Della had found, which was a place that had chosen him back. Iris Pelham came up twice a season with her herbs and her news and slept under her mother's pieced quilt on a bunk coal built against the wall. Orrin Kemp came up in the second spring with a second load of iron stock and stayed a week teaching Cole the trade Silas Renner had taught Della. Josiah Meese sent up a paper of garden seed with a note that said only that Adelaide had kept her garden on the south side and to try there. And Della turned a patch of ground 20 feet by 30 on the south side of the walls and planted potatoes and turnips and cabbage and a row of hardy peas. And by late summer she was carrying baskets of them into the north room to cure in the dry mountain air. Voss Crossing became a thing. People spoke of the length of the range. Freighters coming up from the wagon road to hunt in the fall stopped there for coffee and a night out of the weather. Trappers coming down in the spring with their pelts stopped to shoe their horses at the anvil inside the south gate. And Della took payment in coin when a traveler had it, and in trade when he did not, and she wrote each transaction into a green cloth-bound ledger. She kept on the mantel, in the square pencil hand, that was Adelaide's hand as much as her own now, because a way of making letters is a thing that can be inherited across a grave by anyone patient enough to study it. The $825 had done its work and was gone, most of it into Finch's fees, and the filing and the long grind of the summer, and Della never once regretted the spending, because it had bought the one thing Adelaide had saved it to buy, which was that the walls still stood and someone who understood them stood inside. But she found, going through the north room in the second autumn, moving the loose hearthstone to sweep beneath it out of a habit she could not break, that the hollow was not as empty as she had left it. There was a thing at the bottom she had missed in the first startled days, pressed flat against the tin where the shadow of the stone had hidden it, and she drew it out into the light and found it was a photograph, an old one, silvered and faded, of a man and a woman standing stiff and unsmiling before a wall of squared timber that Della knew at a glance, because she had run her own hands along those very notches. The man was broad and bearded with a carpenter's forearms. The woman beside him was younger than Della had pictured her, straight-backed and clear-eyed, with a set to her jaw that Della recognized because she had felt it in her own face in the land office and the courtroom and the smoke. And on the back, in the square, hard-pressed pencil, were 4 words and a year. William and Adelaide, and beneath it, ours. She set the photograph on the mantel between the 2 compasses, and she stood a long time looking at the 3 things together, the 2 needles and the 2 faces, all of them pointing, in their way, at the same true north, across the same long distance. And she thought of the chain of it, the surveyor who had walked this country with a compass and marked a fort no one believed in. The woman who had built that fort and kept a matched compass in red flannel against the day someone worthy came. The money saved out of years alone and left beneath a stone. The girl who had ridden up to settle an argument about a map and stayed to keep faith with a stranger she would never meet. None of them had known the others would come. Each of them had built or saved or marked or held on the pure blind faith that someone, someday, would find the thing they left and know it for what it was. That was the whole of it, Della understood. Standing in the room a dead woman had built. That was what the walls had always been. Not a fort, not a claim, not even a home, but a message passed hand to hand down the years by people who trusted that the next hand would be worthy of it, and the only way to answer such a message, the only way that had ever existed, was to become worthy and pass it on. She was 19 years old the autumn she found the photograph, and she would hold Voss Crossing better than 50 years, and the sign above the gate would be repainted a dozen times in a hand that grew less like Adelaide's and more like her own. As the decades wore the difference away, and children not yet born would learn to shoe a horse at that anvil, and to read the old charts in the tin trunk, and to lift the loose hearthstone and marvel at the hollow, where a fortune had once waited for the right pair of hands. But that was all still ahead of her, unwritten. On the autumn evening, she set the last piece of Adelaide Voss on the mantel and stepped back and let the firelight hold all 3 of them together. Below the bench, the creek ran on toward the settlement and the county seat and the wide country beyond, exactly as it had run when William Voss first squared a log on this shelf, and exactly as it would run when the last of them was gone. The walls stood dark and sound around her, against a sky going green at the ridgeline, and Della Whitcomb, who had been counted out of one place with $200 and a folded note, stood in the middle of the place she had been counted into by a woman she had never met, and she was not cast off and she was not alone, and she was, at the long last of it, precisely and immovably home.